Here's something that's going to bother you for the rest of the day. Picture a massive container ship. We're talking 400 meters of steel, carrying tens of thousands of tons of cargo. Now picture a small fishing boat puttering along next to it. Common sense tells you the little boat should be nippy, agile, quick off the mark. Common sense, it turns out, is completely wrong. That container ship is almost certainly faster. And the reason why goes deep into the physics of water, waves, and hull design in a way that very few people ever stop to think about. Hi, my name is Kyle and this is Ships Explained. The basics, how a hull moves through water. Before we can talk about speed, we need to talk about what actually happens when you push a hull through water. Because water is not nothing. It has mass, it has resistance, and it really does not want to get out of the way. When any vessel moves through water, it has to physically displace that water. The hull pushes water aside at the bow, and then the water rushes back in to fill the void left at the stern as the ship moves forwards. That process of constantly pushing and displacing water is where the majority of a ship's resistance comes from. We call these vessels displacement hulls because that is literally what they do. They sit in the water and they displace it. Now here's the first thing to understand. That displacement process does not just create resistance in a simple, linear way. It creates waves. Every time a hull moves through water, it generates a wave system. You can see this clearly enough by watching a boat go past. You get that distinctive wash spreading out behind it. But what is actually happening beneath the surface and at the bow is where things get really interesting. As the hull pushes forward, it creates a pressure wave at the bow. That wave has a certain height, and crucially, it has a certain length. We call that a wavelength. That wavelength is not fixed. It changes depending on how fast the ship is traveling. Here is the key relationship. Try to hold on to this, because everything else builds on it. The faster the ship goes, the faster that bow wave travels, and the longer its wavelength becomes. Speed and wavelength are directly proportional. That one simple relationship is the foundation of everything we are going to talk about today. Wave making and hull speed. So we've established that as a ship speeds up, the wavelength of its bow wave increases. Now let's follow that logic and see where it takes us. At slow speeds, the bow wave is short and stubby. The wavelength is much shorter than the ship itself. As the ship speeds up, that wavelength stretches out. At some point, and this is where it starts getting really interesting, the wavelength grows to about 2/3 of the ship's length. When that happens, the peaks and troughs of the bow wave system start to line up with the stern wave system that is being generated at the back of the hull. The two systems add together what is called constructive interference, and you get a big dramatic wash behind the ship. If you've ever been overtaken by a fast vessel in a small boat, you'll be very familiar with the result. Not ideal. As speed increases further still, you eventually reach a point where the wavelength equals the ship's length. Now the bow wave and the stern wave are destructively interfering. They are actually canceling each other out to some extent. There is less visible wash. But here is the cruel irony. Your hull is now sitting between exactly one wave peak at the bow and one at the stern, with a trough in the middle. Your hull is effectively sailing uphill into its own wave. The resistance is at its absolute highest. This is what we call hull speed, and you can actually calculate hull speed. There is a formula for it, and it is beautifully simple. Speed in knots equals 1.34 times the square root of your waterline length in feet. Let me give you some real examples to make this stick. Take the Queen Mary II. She has a waterline length of around 1,132 feet. Run that through the formula and you get a hull speed of around 45 knots. Now take a 300-foot coastal freighter. Its hull speed works out at around 23 knots. An 80-foot commercial workboat comes in at around 12 knots. And a 20-foot pleasure boat, 6 knots. 6. You can practically swim faster than that on a good day. Now look at those numbers. Notice something? The bigger the ship, the higher the hull speed. And that is before we have even talked about engines or hull design. The geometry alone is giving larger ships a head start. The hump and what happens beyond it. Now here's where small boats really start to suffer, and where things get a little brutal if you're on the wrong side of the size equation. If you try to push a displacement hull past its hull speed, you run headfirst into what naval architects call the hump. I want you to picture this clearly, because the name is very literal. As the ship tries to accelerate beyond its hull speed limit, the stern begins to squat down into the water, the bow rises up, and the whole vessel takes on this awful nose-high attitude, like it is desperately trying to claw its way out of the sea. It is not succeeding. What is actually happening is the ship is trying to climb its own bow wave, and that bow wave has absolutely no intention of cooperating. The resistance at this point does not just increase, it spikes. Fuel consumption goes through the roof. Speed gains become tiny relative to the enormous amounts of additional power being thrown at the problem, and the whole exercise becomes deeply uneconomical very quickly. Now theoretically, if you could generate enough power, you could push through the hump entirely. And on the other side of it lies something called planing, where the hull stops fighting through the water and instead rises up on top of it. Resistance drops away dramatically, and genuinely high speeds become possible. It sounds brilliant. The catch, of course, is that planing only works with hulls specifically designed for it. Fine, lightweight, flat-bottomed hulls built from the keel up to operate that way. Your speedboat, your rib, your high-performance racing craft, a fully loaded container ship cannot plane. I want to be very clear about that. The hull form is wrong, the weight is catastrophically wrong, and the engine power required to even attempt it would be something so absurd it defies description. We're not talking bigger engines. We're talking a fundamentally different universe of propulsion. It simply isn't on the table. For the odd exception, like certain high-speed ferries, clever hull design and serious horsepower can get a vessel over the hump into semi-planing territory. But even then, it's an enormous engineering effort to achieve what a small speedboat does, almost accidentally. So for the overwhelming majority of commercial vessels working the world's shipping lanes every single day, your container ships, your tankers, your bulk carriers, and your general cargo vessels, hull speed is the hard ceiling. There is no climbing over it. There is no sneaking around it. And that ceiling, as we've established, is set directly and unavoidably by one thing: the length of the ship. Why bigger ships have a natural speed advantage. Right, so now we can really get to the heart of it. Why are bigger ships faster? The answer, when you strip it all back, is waterline length. Longer ships have a higher hull speed. It is as simple as that. But let me explain why that actually translates into a real-world speed advantage. Because it is not just about having a higher theoretical ceiling. Think about the resistance curve of a ship plotted against speed. It is not a smooth, straight line. It has bumps and dips in it. Little sweet spots where resistance is relatively low, and peaks where resistance is punishingly high. Those sweet spots and those peaks occur at different speeds depending on the length of the ship. For a small vessel, say that 20-foot pleasure boat with a hull speed of 6 knots, the resistance becomes prohibitive very quickly. By the time she is doing 5 knots, she is already approaching her limit. She is burning fuel, fighting waves, and working extremely hard just to maintain that speed. Push her to 7 or 8 knots, and the fuel consumption goes through the roof. Now take that 400-meter container ship. Her sweet spots occur at much higher speeds. She can cruise comfortably at 20, 22, even 25 knots because her hull length means the wave interactions that create peak resistance do not happen until those much higher speeds. She is sitting in an efficient part of her resistance curve, while the small boat is completely buried in hers. It is a bit like comparing a long-legged runner to a short-legged one. The longer stride just covers ground more naturally and efficiently. The physics favor the bigger vessel. And here is something that always gets me. This advantage exists essentially for free. It is purely a consequence of geometry. No extra engineering required. Build a longer ship, and you have automatically shifted all those resistance peaks to higher speeds. The engineering tricks that change the game. Now, naval architects being the clever lot that they are, they have not just accepted the physics and left it at that. There are several engineering solutions that push these numbers even further in favor of larger and sometimes smaller vessels. The most famous of these is the bulbous bow. If you look at the bow of any modern large ship at or just below the waterline, you will see a strange rounded bulge protruding forward from the hull. It looks a bit odd, honestly. The first time I saw one up close, I genuinely thought something had gone wrong somewhere, but it is entirely deliberate. What that bulb does is generate its own small wave system, timed specifically to destructively interfere with the primary bow wave. The two waves cancel each other out, reducing the overall wave-making resistance of the hull. On large ships traveling at their typical cruising speeds, a well-designed bulbous bow can reduce fuel consumption by anywhere from 10 to 15%. On a vessel burning hundreds of tons of fuel per day, that is an absolutely enormous saving. Then, there is hull form. The shape of the hull itself has a massive impact on how efficiently it moves through water. Fine lines, think a long, narrow hull with a sharp entry at the bow, disturb the water far more gently than a blunt, full-bodied hull. High-speed ferries are a great example of this. Take a 300-foot ferry running a regular passenger route. By rights, her hull speed formula says she should top out around 23 knots, yet some of these vessels comfortably operate at 35 or even 40 knots. The reason is a combination of fine hull lines, careful design around the hump, and enough engine power to push through it. Of course, engine power is always part of the conversation. If you have enough of it, you can brute force your way past some of these resistance issues. But in the commercial world, that approach gets very expensive, very quickly. Fuel is one of the largest operating costs for any ship operator, and throwing more engine power at the problem tends to make accountants cry. So the focus is always on optimizing the hull form first and supplementing with power second. There is also something called the length-to-beam ratio, basically how long the ship is relative to how wide it is. A higher ratio, meaning a longer, thinner ship, generally produces less wave-making resistance. Container ships tend to have quite high ratios for this reason. Bulk carriers and tankers, which prioritize cargo volume over speed, tend to be wider and stubbier in comparison. Different jobs, different shapes, different speed profiles. Real-world examples. Let's bring all of this together with some real numbers, because I think that's where it really clicks. Your modern large container ships, the ones doing the Asia to Europe runs, the trans-Pacific routes. These vessels are typically around 350 to 400 meters long. Their cruising speed sits around 20 to 25 knots. That's fast. That is genuinely fast for a vessel of that size. And it is achievable because their waterline length gives them a hull speed in the mid-40s, meaning they are cruising well within their efficient operating range. Feeder container ships, the smaller vessels that collect cargo from regional ports and bring it to the big hubs, are typically around 100 to 150 meters long. Their cruising speeds are more in the range of 14 to 17 knots. Not slow by any means, but meaningfully slower than their larger cousins. And the hull speed formula tells you exactly why. The Queen Mary II is worth a mention here because she is a special case. She has a service speed of around 28 to 30 knots. For a passenger vessel, that is extraordinary. Her sheer length, over 345 meters, combined with fine hull lines and a power plant producing over 157,000 horsepower, gives her a performance envelope that most ships can only dream about. She is, in many ways, the perfect illustration of everything we have talked about today. And then, at the other end of the scale, you have your small harbor tugs, your pilot boats, your small fishing vessels, capable, tough, built for their specific jobs. But fast, not particularly. And it is not because they have bad engines or poor design. It is because the physics simply do not favor them. The exceptions and caveats. Now look, I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't acknowledge that the rule has exceptions. Planing hulls, as we touched on earlier, operate on a completely different set of principles. A well-designed 20-foot speedboat can hit 40 knots or more. A racing powerboat can exceed 100 knots. These vessels have effectively escaped the displacement hull speed limitation altogether by climbing up on top of the water. Similarly, hydrofoils and hovercraft sidestep the problem entirely by removing the hull from the water altogether. No hull in the water means no wave-making resistance. A whole different game. But for the vast majority of commercial shipping, the container ships, the tankers, the bulkers, the ferries, and the cruise ships, we are firmly in displacement hull territory. And in that world, size genuinely is an advantage when it comes to speed. So the next time you are watching a container ship slide past the harbor entrance, and you find yourself thinking that something that big really should not be moving that quickly, you are right to be surprised. But now you know exactly why it is happening. Bigger ships are not faster just because they are bigger. They are faster because their length shifts the entire wave resistance curve up the speed axis, giving them naturally higher sweet spots and a higher hull speed ceiling. The physics, for once, are actually on their side. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video and have liked learning about why size really does matter when it comes to ship speed. For more content like this every other Friday, be sure to subscribe right here on the channel. Until next time, thank you for watching and goodbye.